Every morning, Ukraine's General Staff releases a number. It appears on an official government page, it gets picked up by wire services, it circulates briefly through defense-focused social media accounts, and then it disappears into the vast stream of daily war reporting, replaced by the next strike update, the next diplomatic development, the next territorial shift measured in hundreds of meters along a front line that stretches for 1,000 kilometers. On June 23, 2026, that number was 1,390. 1,390 Russian military personnel killed or seriously wounded in a single day of fighting in Ukraine, and almost nobody. Stop to ask the question that number demands. Not what is the daily tally, but what does it mean that this number, appearing every single morning, has been running at this level for months, and what is the even larger number that the daily figure does not capture, the number that tells you the true scale of what Russia has paid, and is still paying, for a war that began with the promise of a 3-day victory. Stay with me, because by the time we are done here, you are going to understand not just the 1390 figure from June 23, 2026, but the entire architecture of Russian military losses in this war, what the daily number means, what the cumulative number of 1,394,530 total casualties since February 24, 2022 actually represents in human and strategic terms, what the parallel counting methodologies that arrive at very different numbers tell us about the true scale of the catastrophe Russia is sustaining, and why the number that nobody is counting, the number of Russian men who are gone from their communities, their families, their workplaces, their futures, regardless of whether they are counted as killed or wounded or missing, is the number that will define Russia as a society for a generation after this war ends. Let us begin with what we know, because even the most conservative accounting of Russian losses in this war is extraordinary. On June 23, 2026, Ukraine's General Staff reported 1,390 Russian military personnel killed or seriously wounded in the preceding 24 hours. This was not an unusual figure. Looking at the daily reporting across the preceding week, the numbers read as follows: 1,390 on June 23, 1190, on June 22, 1290, on June 21, 1240, on June 20, 1370, on June 19, 1370, on June 18, 1260, on June 17, 7 consecutive days of daily Russian casualties ranging from 1190 to 1390 personnel every day, week after week, month after month. The cumulative total as of June 23, 2026, according to Ukraine's General Staff, stands at approximately 1,394,530 Russian military personnel killed or seriously wounded since the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion on February 24, 2022, 1,394,530, in 4 years and 4 months of war. That number is so large that it resists easy comprehension, and that resistance to comprehension is part of why it disappears so quickly from the news cycle every morning. Human beings are not designed to intuitively grasp the weight of numbers at this scale. So, let us put it in context that makes the scale tangible. The Soviet Union lost approximately 15,000 soldiers in 10 years of fighting in Afghanistan, a war that helped destabilize the Soviet state, that produced a decade of grief and political trauma inside Russia, that is still referred to in Russian culture as the Afghan wound. Russia has now suffered nearly 93 times. That figure in 4 years in Ukraine. The United States lost 58,000 soldiers in more than a decade in Vietnam, losses that tore American society apart, ended a presidency, and produced political and cultural reverberations that shaped the country for a generation. Russia has now suffered more than 24 times the American total in Vietnam, in less than half the time. The Center for Strategic and International Studies noted in its most recent analysis that Russia has suffered more losses than any major power in any war since World War II. And those losses are not stopping. They are running at 1,390 per day. The three numbers and what each one tells you. Before we go any further, we need to address the elephant in the room that serious analysts always raise when the Ukrainian General Staff casualty figures appear. These are Ukrainian government figures, and they cannot be independently verified. That is true, and it matters, but dismissing the figures entirely because they come from one of the parties to the conflict misses something important, which is that there are now multiple independent counting methodologies that, while arriving at different totals, all point in the same direction and agree on the fundamental reality that Russia has suffered catastrophic losses. The first counting methodology is the Ukrainian General Staff figure, approximately 1,394,530 personnel killed or seriously wounded as of June 23, 2026. This is the most comprehensive figure and the one that most closely tracks with the combined killed, wounded, missing, and captured accounting that military historians use for total casualty figures in past conflicts. The second counting methodology comes from independent Russian investigative journalists at Mediazona and the BBC Russian service, who have been painstakingly documenting confirmed Russian deaths through obituaries, social media posts, death notices in local Russian media, changes to official memorial registers, and other verifiable sources. By June 5, 2026, this methodology had produced a confirmed named list of 225,000 Russian soldiers whose deaths can be verified through open-source documentation. Mediazona estimates, based on statistical analysis of the confirmed figures against demographic data from Russia's regions, that the actual death toll of Russian forces counting only servicemen and contractors, excluding allied militia forces, was between 347,776 and 502,344 as of June 12, 2026. The third counting methodology comes from CSIS, whose analysis published in 2026 concluded that Russia has suffered nearly 1.2 million casualties since February 2022, a figure that aligns closely with the Ukrainian General Staff reporting when accounting for the time period covered and the definition of casualties used. Ukrainian Commander-in-Chief Oleksandr Syrsky reported that Russian forces suffered over 141,500 total casualties between January and May 2026 alone, including more than 83,000 killed. That 5-month sub-period figure is itself larger than the Soviet total in Afghanistan. These three methodologies, Ukrainian government reporting, independent Russian investigative journalism, and Western defense analysis, produce different absolute numbers because they count different things and have access to different information, but they converge on the same inescapable conclusion: Russia has suffered military casualties in this war at a scale that has no precedent in the post-World War II era, and those casualties are continuing to accumulate at a rate of more than 1,000 per day. What 1,390 in a day actually looks like the human geography of loss. The daily figure of 1,390 is abstract until you try to give it geographic and human texture. Russia is a vast country of approximately 144 million people spread across 11 time zones and 85 federal subjects. But the casualty burden of this war has not fallen evenly across that geography. It has fallen heavily, disproportionately, and in some cases catastrophically, on specific regions whose demographic profiles and economic conditions made their men more vulnerable to the recruitment pressures that have driven Russian military manpower throughout this conflict. Mediazona's regional mapping of confirmed Russian losses reveals a pattern that tells a story about who is actually dying in this war. The regions with the highest absolute casualty figures are the large population centers: Moscow, Moscow Oblast, St. Petersburg, Krasnodar Krai. But when adjusted for population, the burden falls heaviest on Russia's poorer, more rural, and more ethnically diverse regions: Buryatia, Tuva, Dagestan, Chechnya, and the regions of Siberia and the Russian Far East, where military service represents one of the few pathways to the financial bonuses and social status that recruitment has been offering. The men dying at 1,390 per day in the fields and trenches of eastern Ukraine are not drawn evenly from across Russian society. They are drawn disproportionately from the communities that Russian economic policy has left furthest behind. By June 5, 2026, Mediazona had confirmed the deaths of 7,226 Russian military officers, a figure that tells its own story about the command structure degradation Russia has suffered. 15 Russian generals have been killed in this conflict, a number that reflects both the extraordinary lethality of the battlefield, environment, and the targeting work of Ukrainian intelligence that has made senior Russian command positions genuinely dangerous. The proportion of officer deaths among overall confirmed casualties has declined as the war has progressed from as high as 10% in the early weeks when Russia's professional contract force bore most of the fighting to between 2 and 3% by late 2024, as the mass mobilization of volunteer infantry filled the front lines with men whose death does not generate official press releases. That declining officer percentage is itself a data point. It reflects the shift from professional military operations to mass infantry attrition, where the burden of dying has moved from trained officers to barely trained recruits. In February 2026, a significant intelligence milestone arrived. The Telegraph reported that for the first time since the invasion, Russia was losing more soldiers than it was able to recruit. Western officials assessed that Russia was losing approximately 40,000 personnel per month since November 2025. a figure that exceeds even the extraordinary casualty rates of the preceding year. At 40,000 losses per month, Russia is consuming its military manpower at a pace that its recruitment system, relying on financial incentives, coercive pressure on prisoners, and regional mobilization quotas, cannot sustainably replace. That is the strategic meaning of the daily 1,390 figure. Not just that men are dying, but that they are dying faster than Russia can find new ones. The equipment behind the number 74 artillery systems in 24 hours. Personnel casualties do not exist in isolation from equipment losses. Every day, alongside the human figures, Ukraine's general staff also reports the destruction of Russian military hardware. On June 23, alongside the 1,390 personnel casualties, the general staff reported the destruction of 6 Russian tanks, 74 artillery systems, more than 600 vehicles, and multiple other categories of military equipment, including aircraft, drones, and anti-aircraft systems. These figures deserve the same contextual analysis as the personnel numbers, because together they paint a picture of the material cost Russia is absorbing. 74 artillery systems destroyed in a single day. An artillery system, depending on the type, whether it is a self-propelled howitzer, a towed artillery piece, a multiple-launch rocket system, or a mortar battery, costs between several $100,000 and several $1 million to manufacture, requires months to produce. In modern defense industrial conditions, and takes significant time and resources to move to the front position, supply with ammunition, and crew with trained personnel. Destroying 74 of them in 24 hours means destroying an investment of hundreds of millions of dollars in a single day, every day. The arithmetic of that equipment, attrition, sustained over months and years, is what CSIS was capturing when it noted that Russia is paying an extraordinary price for minimal gains while its war economy comes under mounting strain, with manufacturing declining and growth slowing to 0.6% in 2025. Russia has attempted to compensate for its equipment losses through accelerated domestic production and through weapons imports from North Korea, Iran, and with the tacit support of China. North Korean artillery ammunition deliveries have been particularly significant, providing Russia with the shell volumes it needs to sustain its artillery-heavy operational style. But even with these imports, Russia's equipment losses are running at a pace that creates real operational constraints. The loss of 88 artillery systems per day, sustained over months, means that Russian artillery units on the front lines are cycling through equipment faster than replacement can keep pace. Units that arrive with full complements of guns find themselves operating with progressively degraded firepower as their systems are destroyed and not replaced at the rate needed. The number nobody is counting what 1.4 million casualties means for Russia's future. There is a number embedded inside the 1,394,530 figure that does not appear in any official reporting, but that is, in many ways, the most consequential number of all. It is the number of Russian men who are permanently absent from Russian society, not just killed, not just wounded, but gone in some form from the communities, families, workplaces, and futures they occupied before this war began. Consider what 1.4 million casualties means in demographic terms for a country of 144 million people. The number of Russian men under the age of 60 who were available in Russia's pre-war population is estimated at roughly 55 to 60 million. The CSIS analysis noted that the number of Russian soldiers killed in this war amounts to between 0.5 and 1.2% of that pre-war male cohort. That figure, between 0.5% and over 1% of all Russian men of working age killed, represents a demographic wound that Russia will not heal quickly. The Economist's analysis of October 2025, drawing on satellite data and more than 200 credible estimates from Western governments and independent researchers, found that Russia's total casualty toll had increased by 60% since the start of 2025 alone, with over 100,000 soldiers killed in the first 10 months of 2025, even if Ukrainian casualty figures were twice as high as the Ulysses Project documents. The ratio of Russian to Ukrainian soldiers killed would still run at approximately 5-1 in Ukraine's favor. Beyond the killed and officially wounded, there are the men who returned from the war alive but damaged in ways that official casualty figures do not capture. Post-traumatic stress disorder, traumatic brain injuries from artillery concussion, amputations, burns, and other severe physical injuries. These are the wounds that follow men home and that shape families, communities, and social services for decades. Russia has no serious national infrastructure for addressing the mental health consequences of mass combat trauma. the Soviet experience after Afghanistan, where returning veterans found their suffering officially ignored and socially stigmatized, offers a grim preview of what awaits the men who survive this war and carry it home inside them. And then there are the structural economic consequences. Russia's labor market has been severely distorted by the absorption of hundreds of thousands of working-age men into the military over the past 4 years. Factories that cannot find workers, agricultural regions that cannot find seasonal labor, construction projects that stall. For lack of crews, service industries stretched thin. The Russian government has tried to paper over these distortions with emergency wage legislation and financial incentives, but the labor market effects of removing this many working-age men from the civilian economy are not easily compensated. They compound across years. They interact with the sanctions-driven economic constraints that Russia is simultaneously managing, and they'll end heaviest in the rural and regional communities that were already most economically vulnerable, the same communities that provided disproportionate shares of the men who are now counted in the daily casualty figures. What 251 combat engagements in 24 hours tells you about the frontline reality alongside the June 23 casualty figure? Ukraine's General Staff reported something that provides essential context for understanding how those 1,390 casualties were generated: 251 combat engagements between Ukrainian defense forces and Russian troops in a single 24-hour period, 251 separate engagements across the Pokrovsk sector, the Huliapol direction, the Kostyantynivka front, the Sloviansk sector, and multiple other points along the 1,000-kilometer line of contact. In Donetsk Oblast, the battle for Kostyantynivka has reached a new phase of intensity. Russian forces have broken into the outskirts of the city, opening what analysts are describing as the battle for the last Donbas fortress belt, a string of urban centers that represent the final significant Ukrainian defensive positions before Russian forces would reach the administrative boundaries of Donetsk Oblast that Putin has claimed as Russian territory. The fighting for Kostyantynivka is being conducted at close quarters, in urban terrain that both amplifies casualties and makes the tactical picture harder to assess from a distance. What is clear is that the 390 casualties reported on June 23 were generated in a battlefield environment of extraordinary intensity. 251 engagements in 24 hours works out to more than 10 separate combat contacts every single hour around the clock across a front that spans multiple operational directions simultaneously. The Russian military is absorbing those losses and continuing to press. That fact is important and should not be minimized. Russia's willingness to sustain casualties at this rate and continue offensive operations reflects both the Kremlin's political commitment to this war and the realities of a mobilization system that has generated enough manpower to keep frontline units supplied with replacements even as those replacements are consumed at extraordinary rates. But willingness to sustain losses is not the same as capacity to sustain them indefinitely. The February 2026 intelligence assessment that Russia is losing more men than it can recruit is the line where willingness meets mathematics. You can be willing to absorb unlimited casualties. You cannot actually absorb unlimited casualties if you run out of the men to absorb them with. The soldier from Beryasha and what the number means in a village. There is a village in the Republic of Beryasha, in the Russian Far East, 7 time zones from the front lines in eastern Ukraine. It is the kind of village that Russian demographic statistics describe as a place of outmigration, young people leaving for the cities, the population aging, the economic base shrinking. Before this war began, the most reliable route out of this village for a young man without university prospects was military service. The bonuses were significant relative to local wages. The status was real. The alternative was staying and watching your future narrow. That village has now sent dozens of its men to Ukraine. Some have come back. Some have come back changed in ways that nobody in the village has the language or the institutions to address, and some are counted in the 1390. Not today's 1,390 specifically. There is no way to know which day's figure contains any particular soldier's name. But somewhere in the 1,394,530, there are men from this village. Men whose absence is felt at the table, in the fields, in the families that are now waiting for a knock on the door or a message on a phone, or who have already received that knock and that message and are living with what comes after. Multiply that village by the thousands of villages, towns, and city neighborhoods across 11 time zones that have sent their men to this war. Multiply it by 4 years and 4 months of daily figures that run between 1,190 and 1,440. And you begin to approach the number that nobody is counting, not the official Tally, not the Mediazona list, not the CSIS estimate, but the full human weight of what 1,394,530 casualties actually means when it is distributed across a country and a society and lived one family at a time. That weight does not appear in a morning press release. It does not trend on social media. It does not produce a map update or a diplomatic statement. It accumulates quietly in villages and apartments and waiting rooms of military registration offices across Russia, one notification at a time, one name at a time, one family at a time. It is the number behind the number, and it is the number that will outlast this war, shaping Russia's demography, its politics, its social fabric, and its relationship with the generation that lived through it for decades to come. 1,390 in a single day, 1,394,530 since February 24, 2022, and a number beyond that, the number of men who are simply gone, in all the ways that men are gone from wars that no official figure has ever fully captured and no official figure ever will. That is the number nobody is counting. Now you know it exists.